Well, thank you very much, Kate. It's a great pleasure for me to join with you and all of your guests today for this lunch. Can I join you in acknowledging that we're doing that on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and it's great to be back on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I know we're not going to talk about sport, but I am particularly grateful today to have a reason not to be in New South Wales, because I can tell you, even though I left very early this morning, they're insufferable today. To Kate and all of her team at YWCA Queensland, thank you for the opportunity. I should say I'm here this afternoon for another event, and I let Kate know that I was going to be in town and said I'd love to drop in and meet her team and talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing in common. Well, Kate Tully's not the kind of person who lets a chance go by, and she said, I don't want to talk to you, I want to make money out of you, let's have a lunch. And I think it's that kind of attitude that's really seeing YWCA Queensland go ahead in leaps and bounds. So thank you for supporting Kate and the organisation here. I've been invited to share a conversation with you today, and it's not easy to have a conversation with a room full of women this big, but in my experience the best conversations are the ones that start in one place and end up in an entirely different place. So I do really encourage you when we have lunch, when we finish lunch, feel free to not only ask questions but to take us on to an entirely different topic, put a comment, an idea, and we can take it from there. So if I don't touch in my comments today on an issue that you're interested in, please don't feel constrained about anything that you might like to talk about afterwards. In thinking to myself, what would I talk about today, I thought the issues that most women who I meet for the first time or who I don't know very well ask me about, particularly in relation to my experience of leadership, really fall into a couple of categories, and it's often these issues that we want to talk about the most. So I'm going to talk about the three C's today: career, chaos and confidence, and my experience of them in the leadership roles that I've held. I thought I'd start with career because it really, for me, when I look back over the many years of my career from my early days post-university, I think it's interesting to see. It's as windy as the Brisbane River, really. My very first aspiration, when I consciously for the first time thought I want to be that when I grow up, was when I was at a very small Catholic primary school on the Gold Coast, and I wanted to be a nun. And I very seriously wanted to be a nun. And Pam Parker's here. I'm coming to you, Pam Parker, eventually, so don't worry about that. She wanted to be a nun as well. We would have made a great pair of nuns for about 5 minutes, I think. But I start there because I think it's important. Why did I want to be a nun? Because nuns were all I saw around me in terms of what a woman could do in a job that was doing something interesting, that seemed to be independent. And I think for me that's a good reminder that little girls and little boys can dream and they can make things up and they have great imaginations, but it's so much easier if they can see women doing things that they would like to be able to do, and that's how we help them dream. And so for me, one of the reasons we want to see women leaders in the arts, in politics, in corporate Australia, in space travel, is I want the next generation of Australian children, boys and girls, to be able to dream of anything. And what we see is partly what we understand to be possible. Of course, women have been able to break through lots of barriers and become firsts when there have been no role models. I know that myself, but it's just so much easier when you can see it around you. So as you know, I did not become a nun. I went on to my first job out of university, as you heard from Kate, was in the social and community welfare sector, working with women and children affected by domestic violence. And I worked in a number of positions in both in Queensland and briefly in Sydney. That was a very important time for me. I learnt a lot about people who were living very different lives than a lot of what I had experienced, and I certainly saw a lot about how much hard work goes into the community sector and how much support they need to do the good work that we all rely on in a civil society. I then went on to work briefly for the union that represented community sector workers, that was then the New South Wales Social Welfare Workers Union. Then came back to Queensland and worked in a white-collar trade union representing staff at universities. Then went into the Queensland public sector for 3 or 4 years, All of this time I had been active in politics. I got very active in politics when I was at university in the late 1970s. It was a very volatile time politically in Queensland. There was lots of interesting things happening, and like a lot of other people, young people my age, I got very involved at that point. I don't come from a political family. I didn't sit around a dinner table where politics were regularly discussed. But that was when I started to take an interest, as a lot of young people do. And then in my mid-30s, Anne Warner, who held the seat that I lived in, South Brisbane, announced that she was retiring, and she was really retiring long before people expected that she would. So suddenly there was a vacancy. It was at a time when there was a lot of debate within the Labor Party about women candidates and affirmative action, a lot of debate also in the other political parties and publicly. And I'd been very much part of those debates, but I was pretty happy being a backroom person, and politics was important to me, but I hadn't seen myself necessarily in that role. And a group of people came and saw me and said, you need to think about putting your hand up. And I had a 14-month-old baby, and I said, oh, look, how about you come back when he's at school? Of course, that isn't how politics works. You know, the train stops and you're either getting on or, you can wait another 20 years, basically, if you want to stay in the same place. So, after a lot of discussion, my family and I thought, yes, the next election was 1995. Wayne Goss was likely to be re-elected. I could sit quietly on the back bench and, sort of manage family and learning about being a politician. And we decided to take the leap and do it. And for those of you who remember Queensland history or are, old enough to have been around, Wayne Goss did win the election, but only by one seat. There was a challenge to one of those seats, and the court upheld the challenge. There was a by-election, Labor lost it, and Rob Borbidge became Premier on the supporting vote of Liz Cunningham. So within 6 months, we were out of government. Peter Beattie took over as leader, and I became a shadow minister on his front bench. And I can tell you there are few harder places in political life than being a front bencher in opposition to an opposition that is that close to government. We were one heartbeat away, and so you're working very, very, very hard to win it back. And so suddenly, this quiet life on the back bench where I'd be getting used to things didn't happen. I was suddenly a front bencher, about 2 years out from an election, a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, and flying all over the state. And without doubt, that was my hardest term. It was very difficult for our family to get used to all of that. I was still learning the ropes, but I'm out the front being a spokesperson. And for any of you who've ever been out the front, you know that you really spend a lot of time in the background researching, making sure you know your facts, sitting up swatting in the middle of the night and all of those sorts of things. We then won government, and as you know from Kate, I went on to become a minister and had a lot of extraordinary opportunities. But I tell you all of that story because I think it's important to set goals in life, and I think it's important to have career goals, but I think it's also important for people to be prepared to abandon them if another opportunity comes along, or to at least open your mind to seeing your life and your life's path in a very different way than you might have otherwise seen it. When I look back and look at all those sort of twists, in some respects they were all going, you can see them as going to one place, but becoming a politician was not something I sat around and dreamt about or ever saw my life going in that direction. The opportunity came and I decided to take it. It could have been a completely catastrophic decision, but thankfully I found myself enjoying it and gradually over a period of time, like to think I got a bit better at it. But it is important, I think, for all of us to just remember that sometimes serendipity plays a role in all of these things, and you can plan all you like, you can have all the development opportunities, and sometimes something else comes along and it's really worth not if it doesn't fit into your plan, don't dismiss it too quickly, because I think that's been a really important part of the opportunities that I've had. One of the other out of all of those experiences, the most common question I've had as a woman, and a woman who's had the opportunity to lead, is how did I manage to do all of that and find a balance with my family life and my children, find a balance as a mother, find a balance with other parts of myself and my life. First of all, when I first began receiving those questions, I'll be honest and say I almost resented them. because none of my male colleagues were ever asked these questions. Some of you might know that my predecessor as Premier, Peter Bligh, Peter and his wife Heather had a daughter, and then 11 months later they had twin boys. So they effectively almost had triplets. And Heather worked for most of the time throughout Peter's political career, and he was never asked about balancing work and family life. And my two children are almost 6 years apart, and certainly I had to work hard to find balance, but I don't think that I could have done it with 3 children under 1. And I think there's probably some interesting lessons from both Peter and Heather about what that was like, but nobody ever asks the question, because it's just assumed that he balanced his responsibilities as a father by having them managed by somebody else, that is his wife. He was a very active father. And I was sitting in his office on a number of occasions when big political issues were happening, and there'd be a phone call about one of the kids or from the kids, and he'd try to juggle that just like we all do. But nobody ever thought that that was an interesting question to ask of him or any of my male colleagues. But I realised that it was an important question because it is actually something that all of us care deeply about and are juggling, and that I was happy to answer it if that's what people cared about. Because I do think as more and more women enter the workforce, no matter what level they're entering at, it's a really tough one. And no matter how much we think we get it right, we're always got a question in our mind about the decisions that we've made. I always say I don't like the word balance, because for me it kind of implies some, harmony, and that was not my experience. And I like to tell people this because I think people ask me the question because they would see me on television, my hair seemed to be done, my lipstick was on the right part of my face, and they would think, that maybe I had an answer, and that my answer, I had a silver bullet that I could give them, and I have to say, sorry, I don't. There's lots of things that I could tell you about being organised and getting the help you need, etc. But I think it's actually important to be very honest about the reality, and the reality is, particularly if you are a working mother of children sort of under, still at school age, regardless of whether they're 16 or 6 months, there will be an element of chaos in your life no matter what you do. And that used to cause me a lot of stress, and at some point I just abandoned the stress. I just thought, this is just what it's going to be like. And as soon as I gave up the idea that other people were somehow managing and I wasn't, I found it a lot easier. So I want to dispel any mythology any of you might have that I ever had a balance, that I was ever in harmony with all of that. We just managed like every other family did. And there was all kinds of chaotic things happening behind the scenes. And most of the time it worked, but if one domino went, every other domino went, and they fell quickly as anything. So I'm just going to tell you 2 very quick stories to illustrate that. It's my first question time as Education Minister. My husband almost never travelled for work, and on that particular 2 nights, there were 2 nights he was actually interstate. My mother, who lived near me and was a great family support for us, was in Toowoomba visiting one of her sisters. And I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning before my first question time as Education Minister with my then 5-year-old vomiting into my hair, which is a very bad place to be because you know that that's probably going to keep happening. There was no support. I didn't have anybody, and I couldn't send him to school. He was in grade 1. So literally I bundled him up, and thankfully I had, great women in my office who also had children that age. And they literally sat with him while he threw up in a bucket, while I did question time, smooth, as if nothing was happening, as if I hadn't been up all night changing sheets, washing my hair, changing pyjamas. I give you that story because I reckon most of you have had something very similar. Those things always happen at the time when there's nothing else around that can help you. The same child, I should find other stories about the other child, but the same child, again, he was in kindergarten, and it was his first sports day that he was going to be attending. And his brother was the house captain for the house that they were in, and so he'd painted his face blue, and he was going to be the mascot for the house cheer squad. So this was his very first sports day, and some of you might remember that I established a commission of inquiry, the Ford Inquiry, into institutional child abuse. And something had come up, and we needed to get the regulation that set it up changed by the governor. And I had to go to Government House, and the governor was only available for an hour at 10:30. And so I had to work out, can I get to sports day and still get to Government House? And we thought, yes, this can all happen. Kindergarten, it's the first race of the day. I'll cab the car, I'll get straight there. So I was wearing a red jacket and a suit. And it was something the media were all interested in, so they were waiting outside Government House for me to talk about it after I'd seen the governor, etc. Anyway, so here comes this 4.5-year-old tearing down in his first race, and like the other mums, I'm lined up at the end, and he's glowing and he's shining with, smiles. And he gets about 3/4 of the way down and he glances sideways and he has that shocking moment when he realises that he's not coming first. And he just starts crying. And then he runs faster to get to me because he's so upset. And by the time he gets to me, he not only has tears running down his face and blue paint falling all down on his t-shirt. Of course, there is now buckets of snot running out of his nose, as you know what 4-year-olds are like when they really, collapse emotionally. And he comes flying into me, and it's not one of those moments that you can step sideways, So I pick him up, and of course, young children who have tears and snot flying down their face, what do? They go in there and they rub it all over you. And I only had a singlet underneath my jacket. So we dealt with all of that. Phoned one of my staff who had a jacket, I can't remember, it was a lime green jacket, and I had on a red suit. And so she came in a car and in a street behind Government House. We got out of the car, changed jackets, snotty jacket back in the boot, and off I went. And I think the governor made no comment about me wearing a red dress and a red skirt and a lime jacket. But I have to say, though, that he remembers that race and he remembers me being there, and it was one of those important little life moments for him. So I'm glad I made that decision. And it's something that we still talk about as a family. But it could have, it was a very fine run thing that could have gone very badly. And as I said, I'm sure all of you have had that kind of experience. So I share those experiences with you because I think it is important to acknowledge that no matter how much we look calm on the outside and how much we manage to actually get everything done we need to get done, the backstory is often quite a different one and quite chaotic. And I really don't want anyone to think that I had it worked out all of the time and that there weren't lots of moments like that for me and for my family. And the third thing I wanted to touch on is confidence. This is something that really has struck me for a long time, and the more that I talk to particularly young women and the longer I've sort of left that political phase behind me, the more I am struck by the continued underconfidence of women to take on the bigger challenges. As someone who has been in a leadership role, who unashamedly wants to see more women doing it, there are lots of structural barriers and lots of attitudinal hurdles that we have to deal with and conquer, but some of those are as much inside ourselves as they are put on us by external structures in society. I'm someone who has tried to encourage both men and women at various times to think about standing for Parliament, and I can tell you, while I've certainly had men say, no, it's not for them, they never say it's because they don't think they could do it. There might be good reasons about, no, I want to do this in the bank, or I want to, my family and I are going to move to Western Australia, or, there might be reasons why they say no, but I've never had a man say, oh, I know, I couldn't do that. It is the first thing that women say to me, the first. And I got to the point where I would say, oh, right, so, you thought the Premier came over here to ask you to do this because you can't do it. You think I've got no judgment about these things. Hadn't thought of it like that. Because I really do want women to confront this issue in themselves. And I'm very honest to say, of course there were times when I thought, God, can I do that? Can I do that? And I'd look around me and think, well, can I do it at least as well as all of the other options? And the answer is usually yes. And I think if that's the case, then, put your hand up. So I'm very interested in some of the discussion that people like Sheryl Sandberg's having at the moment, and I think it's something we all need to talk about. And some of the programs that the Y runs deal very specifically with those sorts of issues. So I think we not only need to examine confidence and issues of confidence in ourselves, but I think it's really important for us to encourage confidence in others. And if you want to create women leaders, sometimes it's as simple as encouraging women to see themselves as potential leaders. Other people saw it in me long before I saw it in myself. There were some of my colleagues in the early days of my political career, those who came and tapped me on the shoulder and said, you should think about running. And then when I did get into Parliament, people who said to me, I'd get up and stand up and talk about things in caucus. And some of the older, more experienced, one guy who I hardly knew, but very well respected senior member of the government. I didn't know him very well when I first started, and I walked out of the caucus where I'd spoken on an issue with a bit of passion one day, and he just took me aside and he said, you could lead the show one day. Keep doing that and you could lead the show. And I hadn't seen myself in that. I was too busy swatting for the next thing. And sometimes it takes somebody else to tell you that you've got a potential that perhaps you're too busy, dealing with vomiting children and what the next thing is, to think about what you might be able to do next. And that's where I come to Pam Parker, because the day after I had that conversation, I first came across Pam Parker, and I saw her at a community event in Logan, and I spoke at that event. It was for a community centre, and Pam at that stage was not the mayor. She was involved in community organisations, and she came up to me afterwards, and she said to the person next to her, she's going to be Premier one day. And I thought, rocks in the head. Who's this crazy woman from Logan? But in fact, you were the first person who ever said it to me. And it was such a long time ago, and it was such a long time between when you said it and when it happened. But it put a different, I thought, what? And I don't pretend that I then went around thinking about it for a long time. I just thought, poor Pam Parker, she's crazy. But I do thank her publicly for being one of the people who said to me early on, you should start seeing yourself in a different light, because that did actually make me think about myself in a different light, and I don't think I would have put my hand up or achieved many of the other things I did if I didn't have people who'd said that early on. And I do want to acknowledge the extraordinary work that Pam does in a very tough area, in a very male-dominated environment. Local government has more women than any other level of government, but there's still not enough of them. And it's great to see the work that Pam's doing in Logan, and I'm thrilled to hear that the Y is part of it. So I'm now standing between a huge room full of women and lunch, and I don't want to stand in that dangerous place for any longer. I'm very happy to talk to you later on. I'm loving being part of the YWCA in New South Wales. I'm thrilled that you're here supporting YWCA Queensland. I don't think anyone should leave the room today without joining YWCA Queensland. I hope you've got membership forms here, because it's an organisation. Basically, we are local, we're national, and we're global. We're active in 120 countries on earth, and we're one of the largest women's organisations in the world. And we're making an impact, whether it's in Logan, in HIV/AIDS in Africa, whether it's great work in Canada. There's stuff happening everywhere, and it's exciting to be part of it, and we'd love to have more of you involved here in Queensland. So look forward to having a conversation with you afterwards.